not talk about big data or no privacy, but I'm going to sort of, in the honor of Halloween, talk about the scary guy with the mask, which is represents disclosure avoidance. And I'm hoping to convince you that it might not be as bad as we think. I'm going to take you through, I was going to say walk you through, but I'll probably run, given the time, sort of take you why we need disclosure avoidance. That's sort of building on what John said. Why I think the current methods at Census Bureau might be problematic and we might want to change them, and why this new idea of noise infusion or noise injection might not be as scary as we think. So why do we need it? Well, I think it all starts with Title 13. So as John said, Title 13 is the law that governs the privacy. Back in the 1950s, it's been there. It's also the law that prevents us, Census Bureau, from sharing the data with other agencies for any other reason but statistical purposes. And the three big things that you look at, like John mentioned, Section 9, the one we really focus on is make any publication whereby the data furnished by any individual under this title can be identified. So that's the key. And the interpretation by Census is that identification doesn't have to be identifying my family, but basically reconstructing the data. And because of that, Census can't then share the rules they use to adjust the data for disclosure, because then that would be reconstruction or re-identification. And there are penalties of $250,000. Most of us might be a special sworn status census employee that have to abide by these rules. So this is also what protects the Census Bureau from sharing whatever, if you have immigration data with other agencies, to do anything, as the first clause says, anything but for statistical purposes. So that's the key guiding factor. So it's all the interpretation of Title 13 of what we mean by identifying somebody, and that's left to the Census Bureau to ensure that there's no identification. The other thing is there are other things out there. There are many reports that have been done that says we should really update our methods of privacy, of disclosure avoidance and privacy protection. And the fact that Google uses it, that's a big draw. So there's this one thing called the fundamental, I'm going to skip that one. So the key is there are a couple committees. One is the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, and they suggested that Census and the federal statistical system more broadly have to adopt state-of-the-art database, cryptography, privacy-preserving, and privacy-enhancing technologies. So that's the goal. That's what's recommended by a bipartisan commission. There's also the National Academy of Sciences that comes out of the CNSTAT committee that was mentioned before, that Bob Groves chaired, that research with academia and industry have to continuously develop new techniques. So we have to work with academia to develop these new techniques, and that federal agencies should adopt these modern techniques. So this is the impetus of doing this new method of disclosure. Now, what is differential privacy? Well, from the literature, it's basically the promise that you will not be affected, adversely or otherwise, by allowing your data to be used in any study or analysis, no matter what other studies, data sets, or information sources are available. So the idea that Census has to protect your data, right, and take into account all the other data that's out there that might be used to identify you. So this is the rub, right? So if Census releases any publication, any tabulation, you could use other data to try to identify people in there, and that's Census responsibility. They've said they've shared that. So the next step is this epsilon differential privacy, which suggests the probability of identification changes by only epsilon. So to me, this is a big deal. Census Bureau usually was, you can't do anything. You have to mask every single identification. So the acknowledgement here is there's actually a probability of identification anyway, but you can't, the probability is never zero. There's always something there. And I think that's a big step, I think, for all of us in this new sense of disclosure. So how do we do it currently? Or how does Census do it currently? Or how did I do it when I was there? I think John mentioned this, aggregation. So we only release stuff at high level. So this is why when you get microdata, you only get a PUMA identification of an area. That's a public use microdata area that has to be over 100,000 people. Because the idea is if you could identify an area under 100,000, you might be able to figure out who those people are. You swap, so this could be you swap people across areas, or you could actually swap characteristics too, okay? And then you top or bottom code. We all know that. You can't have income over 150. That's just top coded. All you see is 150. Then the next two are the new ones. You're adding noise to responses, or you're creating synthetic data. And I'll mention those two in turn. So John talked about this. Obviously, aggregation and swapping. And again, swapping can be either across areas or across characteristics. We could swap the age of people, or change the age, or change something else. And that can be problematic, and I'll show how it can be problematic if you're swapping based on those 10 characteristics in the decennial, and then you match the decennial data to some other external data that has other characteristics. So swapping a couple people who might, by race, might have big impacts on what their income happened to be. And I'll show how that happens. John mentioned this point about there's 25 estimates per person. Just imagine what you could do if you had a problem where you had that much data. You could re-identify or reconstruct anything you want, and that's what I think Census Bureau has shown. You can reconstruct the data. So here's the example of where disclosure has gone wrong. So this is a paper done by Trent Alexander, who's here at ISR, and Betsy Stevenson, who's at Ford School, along with Mike Davern, where they looked at the data that was published, the Census PUMS file, the 5%, now it's only 5%, linked it to the actual data in the RDC, and found out that the ratio of men and women between the public data and the internal data was goofy after age 65. And this was all due to disclosure techniques to hide those people. But it was the disclosure technique was done in such a way that the cells we're concerned about at Census Bureau were the 5-year cells, so it's 65 to 70. So you can see that some of this would average out, but some of the goofy stuff occurs at these lower levels of age group. So they found this and this is in the decennial census, 2000 census, but they also found it in the ACS and the CPS, and you can see that for ages 62 to 64, they're all pretty close, the ratios, but at 65 and 66, they're all over the place. And the CPS is probably the worst. The ACS is bad in green, but the CPS is also bad, and at the time I was running the CPS. So because of this adjustment, we had to re-release all the poverty estimates for people over 65. Because it changed for men and women, the poverty estimates were impacted. And this was based on a current disclosure technique that I can't talk about and I can't tell you what it is, and this is the rub. And so this is the rub for Census. So it'd be great if Census can say, hey, our previous method was so bad, I'll show you how bad it is. They can't do that because that risks the violation of Title 13 of re-identification. The example of success is a recent product done by Raj Chetty, Nathaniel Hendren, Jones, and Porter, who were at Census Bureau, where they took the census data and then linked it to the tax data that Raj does, and they create this opportunity atlas. So this is basically, here's the income when you were a kid, and here's the income now when you're an adult. And they mapped it all across the country for every census tract, okay? Well, the problem is, when they did the linking, they realized that they can't release the data using the internal data. They have to use the disclosure avoidance data. So if this would be the swap data or other things. So if you can imagine, some of these areas down in the South, when you swap them based on age, race, family type, you could be swapping people who have completely different incomes. And so they found when they did the swapping and they released the data, the results were different from what they had with the internal data. However, when they do the differential privacy noise infusion, they could keep a lot of the same relationships. So they could do it in such a way that you can keep a lot more of those correlations depending on how you build in the differential privacy. So this is a success of how they did it. Now again, we can't know how bad it was before, and this is the problem. So this sort of gets to what I think we should do as researchers. So as John said, here's the simple graph. I just stole this from the CSAC presentation of trade-off between accuracy and privacy, right? So again, right, the more accuracy you get, the less privacy you're going to have. And we want to find out what epsilon to choose. What's that best privacy budget, privacy loss budget? So if I'm an economist, I have a linear map, I do a trade-off, I maximize it at that social optimum with a marginal social benefit, so I can do that. The problem is we have no clue what the estimated production technology looks like, right? It could look like this, which would be much better for us in terms of accuracy and privacy. I wouldn't have to trade off nearly as much accuracy as privacy. So we don't know what the loss of accuracy does. You know, I'm certain that most of the researchers, anybody who does actual regressions and research using only the 2010 decennial should get another job. There's only 10 variables, so they're not going to find much, okay? And I can't imagine that the stuff you're going to find is really going to impact the results depending on how you noise infuse that. But if you're going to link it to other things, there could be some other things going on. I also can't imagine any of us, and this is what John was getting at, any of us complaining that somebody could look at me, look at the census and figure out, oh, he's white, he's a man, he's 60, and he's married and his kids don't live there. That's what you get in the decennial. So again, there's not much, that privacy loss might not be that big for the decennial. So this is what we need people's help on, is to estimate those two things. There are issues with differential privacy, as Bob and Brian have looked at. There's no way to get around the fundamental law of information recovery, which is basically the more and more data we have, we're going to be able to find you. There's no way to get around that, right? Even differential privacy is not going to get around that. It's just going to set parameters on the estimates. There's really no difference between multiple releases and synthetic data sets, so we could release all these other data sets as we want, but again, eventually you might be able to figure out who these people are. There's no way to see the raw data. Now this is I think the biggest criticism people are really concerned about. Well, I don't get to see what the real data are. Well, you never get to see what the real data are, right? As Trent showed, you just don't get to see it, right? In fact, the decennial, you only get to see 5% sample. It could be with the differential privacy, you could actually get the entire 100% census data just perturbed a bit. There's also a problem with outliers. They may require larger sample sizes. Again, I think the sample size is a big deal here. And it introduces statistical noise. Again, a lot of us are not comfortable with a data set that has quote unquote noise in it. And it's not clear to me, having been there and seen what we did to perturb some of the data, it's not just it's noise imposed by individual people interpretation of what we think would hide people. Whereas differential privacy, you'll actually hear it. Here it is. Here's the epsilon. Here's the shock of noise. Go at it, right? And you'll be able to adjust your standard errors. You'll be able to do everything with the differential privacy. The big issue, and I think it's hidden in this, is this idea of a privacy budget. So we talked about that epsilon. So this one turns out to be 2.5, and what that means. But 2.5 means that's the total, right? So if I have 2.5, and I'm going to release a national estimate, a state estimate, a county estimate, a tract estimate, a block estimate, and a microdata estimate with all these pumas, I have to add up all those epsilons, and all of those have to be less than 2.5. So this is the problem. So if I have this, and then I want to release a linked data set with the tax data, and try to prove public use data, that's going to have to also be under this epsilon. So the key is, and this is again, what you could reply on the federal register notice, who's going to decide what is it epsilon 10, 2.5, 86? I don't know. Who's going to decide that? And I think that's where we need, where Census needs, in my opinion, us as researchers to sort of say, where are we along these spectrums? And how will this affect other data sets? So let me take a couple minutes to talk about synthetic data. So synthetic data, so there are two ways to do this. You can shock the estimates you get, and I think that's what John was showing. You shock the tract. So in that area, you know the distribution of these characteristics. Or you can actually shock the internal microdata that's used to create. And Census has been doing this for a long time. So these are 4 different areas where they do this. On the map is the biggest one. Then the longitude business database is one where they actually shock the microdata. The SAPI is a small area estimate which actually is used to allocate Title I funding. So here's where they're using a shocked model-based estimate based on the underlying data to actually allocate funds. So it's already done. And then my favorite is the SIP synthetic file, which is the SIP linked to all your Social Security earnings records back to the 1950s. We can find your entire life, but we have to shock that to make it able to be released. And if you look at it, it's not that bad, and I think that's where I think the data set's going. So on the SSB results, it's basically this shock, this synthetic data, where they looked at the distribution of share of household income earned by the wife. There's a sharp cliff at half. So when you hit half, where between husband and wife, there's a big jump between the percentage shares. And if you look at the internal results, you also get the jump. It's a bigger jump, but what you could do is you could do your analysis on the synthetic data, send the code, and this is what they exactly did, to the Census Bureau. They would run it on the internal data, and you could walk away and say, hey, I get the same results, or they're very close, or I'm comfortable using the synthetic data. So what can you do? So the first thing is you respond to those Federal Register numbers. And again, this matters. So I've been there a number of times. I've had to answer these. There was a question on the ACS that was actually retained and not changed because 300 people, organized by Steve Ruggles, sent in 300 letters that basically said the same thing. So if you answer this and say, hey, you know, we need these tabulations, we need this data, we want the raw data, whatever you want to do, it definitely matters because they have to read all these and respond to every single one. The other thing is you can participate in these advisory committees. So you go to CSAC or you go to COPAFS or APTU. So COPAFS is the Council of Professional Associations and Federal Statistics, APTU, Association for Public Data Users. Go to the meetings, make your voices heard. Don't just sit and complain about it. Oh, I'm going to get my data, right? Provide suggestions. Talk to Census staff constantly and do it like you should vote, early and often. And then research this idea of accuracy. Be very specific about the effects of this privacy, of these adjustments, of what this is going to do to the accuracy of your data. We have no idea what this does, but you could research this and figure this out. And the final thing is, and this is a big deal, the problem with disclosure is people don't know what it is. So you go talk to Census Bureau, and I think trying to experience this, you can't get a straight answer. And you can't get answers from people because they don't know what the disclosure is. So if you said, I got this result, but I can't tell you because I'm sworn under Title 13. So if you can train all the census staff and train all of us of how to use this new noise infusion or new synthetic or whatever you want to call it, I think that's the key. And this is also came out of the report by Bob Groves, is that we have to train everybody on these new techniques. Thank you.